As you take the clay from the bag, the best way to do that is with the wire tool. If you take it out and grab it with your hands, you'll be introducing air pockets into it. But if you simply cut it loose like a big piece of cheese, you'll be able to take out chunks of it. You can cut smaller pieces. And with this, we'll go ahead and show you the process of kneading the clay. You want to start with a ball of clay, and we're going to place that down on the table. You're going to use the upper palms of your hands to press down into the clay, pushing away from you. As you push down, you want to make a slight impression with the clay. And you can see with this portion of my hand, this is what I'm using to press down. After you've pressed down, you're going to want to pick up on the part farthest away from you and pull it back up towards you. And you're going to do the same operation again of pushing down with this portion of your hand. With this, we want to create a rolling motion that rolls the clay back on itself. As you do this, you'll need to contain the clay with your hands around it, otherwise it will spread out across the table. This is a spiral wedging method. Some people refer to it as a ram's head method because of the shape that you end up with. But as you're working with this, the clay is thinned out through here, and it will break any air pockets out of it. For any given piece of clay, about 30 seconds to a minute of wedging is sufficient to remove the air pockets. If you're not getting this type of shape, perhaps you're pushing down too hard on the clay, and it will be necessary for you to go ahead and start again. If you do, just roll it back up, form a ball shape, and go back into the wedging process. Again, you want to create a nice rolling rhythm with the clay. Don't try to press, then pick it back up. Just press, twist back. As you work with this clay, it will become more homogeneous and more compacted. Roll it back on itself, tap it down on the table, and you have a perfect shape to start with the throwing process. You want to begin with a dry wheel head and place your clay down in the middle of the wheel. Once you've got the clay down there, you want to go ahead and pat it down to make sure it's securely attached to the wheel head. Once you have it attached, you're going to start it with slow motion and let your finger run around the bottom of the clay to seal it to the wheel so you won't get any water migrating underneath the clay. Once you have the clay attached to the wheel, you want to find some way to brace yourself. You can brace your arms in on your body, you can brace them out on your knees, or you can find some comfortable place in between. Everybody will brace their arms slightly differently, so you find what works best for you. You want to bend forward at the waist so you can use leverage, not arm strength. As we begin the centering process, we want to have the wheel going at a fairly rapid rate. We want to keep enough water on the clay and our hands to make sure that the clay slides very freely under our hands and you don't feel any friction building up. Once you feel it becoming dry underneath your hands, you want to go ahead then and add some more water. You want to take your left hand and using this portion of your hand to brace against this side of the clay. Your right hand will come around in front and using this portion to pull back against the clay. You want to find some way to brace your arms, your hand, and your entire body against the clay. We're going to use leverage rather than brute strength to get the clay to move around. We're going to push in and hold our hands very steady. We want to be sure as we're pushing on the clay that we're not pushing down on the wheel head. This will cause your hands to move around and make your hands very sore. Once it begins to become more round on your hands, then we want to go ahead and squeeze in and bring it up into a taller cone shape. Do this by keeping the same hand position, right hand around it, left hand around the outside. I'm going to squeeze in, allowing the clay to come up between our hands. As the clay begins to rise, then we'll go ahead with both of our hands and continue to squeeze in slightly, moving the clay into a taller cone shape. As you move in from a wider form, you allow your hands to slide in to get around this smaller diameter piece of clay. The process of bringing the clay up into this cone shape will help to align the clay particles and also further wedge the clay. In pushing this clay back down, I want to go ahead and keep it moist again. You're going to use your left hand, this portion, against the outside of the clay here. Your right hand, this portion, again, same hand positions. Now we want to move up from here into this first knuckle of your thumb to push at an angle against the clay. Don't push down straight down, but at an angle. I want to do this with one hand so you can see what's happening to the clay, but when you're doing this, you can use both your hands. Go ahead. Secure your hand against the side and your first knuckle here against the edge, and you actually push the clay over and back down into itself. What is happening as you're pushing down with this portion of your hand, this portion will gather in the clay. It's very important to keep it in a cone shape. If you flatten the top, as you start bringing this back up, it's going to draw clay up around the outside. So again, you're going to push in, letting the clay come up between your hands, then draw that up into a cone shape. You'll use a bit of pressure down at the bottom, but as you pull up along the clay, it will require less pressure for you to get it to move. If you place too much pressure between your hands, or if the clay dries out, you'll have a tendency to tear off the top portion. If that happens, set that aside and work with the rest of the clay. Again, use both your hands to push down. You're going to push down away from you, actually pushing the clay over, and it will come back down into itself. In all these actions, make sure you're keeping your arms well braced. And as you can keep your hands together or your thumbs together to brace them together, you'll be able to find more leverage. Bringing the clay up and down into a cone shape about 2 or 3 times each time you start working with the clay will help make more of a compressed mixture and remove any air pockets that you might have. As you're bringing the clay up and down, you're going to invariably push some clay down underneath your hands. You may either go ahead and use a wooden rib to remove the clay, or use the ends of your fingers. And using the wooden rib, use this angled portion and simply bring it down and scrape the clay away. If you allow a lot of clay to build up on the wheel head, it's going to cause your hands to jump around. So we want to remove that as quickly as possible. As you're working, you're going to have more and more of this clay washed off from your clay body. And it's very important that you go ahead and keep that cleaned off your hands when you start using your tools, because it'll be difficult to pick up a tool and hold on to it securely with all this clay on your hands. Once you're certain that it's centered, then it would be time to open it up and not before. If the clay is not centered, should you open it up and expand it out, it's going to be off-center more and worse than it is before. We can check for center. If you have etched rings in the wheel head, you can sight down along, and the etched ring and the motion of the wheel and the clay should look exactly the same. If there's any movement out from the center, then you'll be able to detect that very easily. You can also take a sharpened tool and bring it up to it till it first starts touching the clay. And if it touches equally all the way around, then you'll know that it's centered. If it's not centered, you're going to have more of a wobble to it. And as you look down at this ring, it's going to look different. Or if you bring a tool up to it till it first starts touching it, It's only going to touch it at one portion. If you have a difficult time with centering the clay, it may be that the clay is too stiff for you to be using. You should wet it some more. Or that you're placing your hands on it too suddenly or releasing pressure too suddenly. It'll be important that as you approach the clay that you very slowly build up any pressures and very slowly release the pressure from it. Any sudden movement will cause it to go off center. You need to work in a nice smooth rhythmic fashion, working with the motion of the wheel. Sometimes bringing it back up into a cone shape, working with a smaller surface area, will help you with the centering process. Again, don't try to open the clay unless it's absolutely centered. When you get finished with the centering process, you want to have the form in a rounded shape. We don't want to let it be in a taller shape because you'll have so far to travel down to open it up. And we don't want it in a much wider shape because you have much more of an area to pull out. Brace your hands around the ball of clay. Put your thumbs on top of each other or beside each other. You find the way that's most comfortable for you. Find that center of the clay, rest your thumb on there, and make a small indentation. I'm going to go ahead and make that indentation, then put a little bit of water in there to lubricate the clay as you're pushing down. Keep your hands around the ball of clay and slowly push down in. Do not try to widen the form. Do not lift up your hands. We'll want to push down until we form a bottom that's about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch thick. And the way we can check that is, once you've opened it up, take your needle tool, stop the wheel, push the needle tool down into the bottom of the clay, bring your finger down to where the needle comes out of the clay and pull it out, and you can check from the end of the needle to the beginning of your finger, and that will be the thickness that will be formed. This is a pretty good thickness if I want to create a deep foot in there. Otherwise, I would go ahead and make it a little bit thinner. If you allow the bottom to remain too thick, you're going to have much more clay in the bottom that's not available to pull up into the wall. If you leave it much thinner, you can have problems with trimming later on. Let's go ahead. I'm going to push back down in here, make it slightly thinner on the bottom. Then I'm going to take my hands away. There's different ways of centering. There's different ways of opening the clay. Besides using your thumbs, you can just use your fingers. You can brace your hand together and push your fingers down in. You can put your fingers in the middle and put the other hand on top to brace. Again, you're bracing your hands together well and just push down with your fingers to open it up. Try these different ways, find which is more comfortable for you. Once I have the clay opened up, then I want to go ahead and expand the interior of the clay. Once I've established the centered portion here, I want to retain that diameter on the outside. I don't want to take this ring or donut of clay much beyond there because there will be nothing underneath to support it. I'm going to pull out towards me. The only thing I'm going to move is my fingers. I'm not going to move my hands. I want to keep myself, again, well braced. Start where I left off with my thumb and just move my finger towards me, creating a flat bottom. And at the end, I'm actually bringing my fingers under to give a slight undercut. Once I've opened up the clay, then I'll need to remember to do two things after each time I've done some operation to the clay. I want to remember to remove the water from the inside and to compress the rim. The reason for removing the water is if I were to allow water to stay in here for an extended period of time, it would make the bottom much wetter than the walls, and it may lead to cracking later on. I want to keep this top rim or lip of the pot compressed, because if I leave it get real thin and weak, it will not retain the roundness of the form. Once I've done that, then I'm ready to begin the pulling process. Before I begin pulling it up, I want to go ahead and clear off some of this clay down here so I can get my fingers under there to pull up the clay. You can do that by just using your thumb to pull the clay away, or you can use the rounded end of your modeling tool to remove some of that clay. During the centering process, I was going fairly quickly. As I go through each operation, I'm going to slow the wheel down more and more. In opening, I'll slow down. In widening the form, I'll slow down. When I get ready to start pulling up the form, I'm going to slow down even further, about half the speed I was going during the centering process. In pulling up this ring of clay, the wall of the pot, if you would imagine this sponge as this wall, I'm going to position my left hand on the inside, the right hand on the outside. I'm going to be using my fingers and the clay in between my fingers. The left hand will go down to the bottom where the floor of the pot is, and that will be here. And the outside hand will go down all the way to the wheel head. So it will be a little bit lower than the inside hand. And this is the orientation I want to keep my fingers all the time. As I squeeze in, I'm going to do most of the squeezing with the outside hand, pushing against the inside finger. I'm going to squeeze in to form a thinner wall thickness. Once I form that distance between my fingers, I'm going to retain that distance without squeezing in further. If I keep squeezing, it will get thinner and thinner and create weak spots in the wall. So I'm going to squeeze in just slightly, keep that distance between my fingers, and move my fingers up along the wall of the clay, squeezing it above. I like to use a small sponge between my finger and the clay to add the moisture. I'll put some moisture on the inside and position my fingers, again, keeping my hands well braced together and keeping my arms braced on my legs. I'm going to squeeze in, and I want to actually pull in towards the inside. As I pull up, I'm having less and less pressure between my fingers. When I get to the top, I'm going to take this sponge and just wrap it right around the top of the pot and push down slightly to strengthen that area. Once I've done that, remove the water from the inside. Every time after I've pulled up the clay or shaped it in some manner where I've added water to the inside, I'm going to remove the water. When I get ready to do the second throw, I also want to remove some clay down here. This way I'll be able to get underneath of there with my fingers and pull up more clay. As I'm pulling up, I'm actually pulling towards the inside to create a cone shape. I do not want to try to pull straight up because the centrifugal force of the wheel will just naturally allow my hands to ride out. So I want to fight against that and pull towards the inside. Now, as I try to get down in here, I have to lift up my arm to get on the interior of the pot. So it's going to be very important for this thumb to rest on my other hand to help me brace myself. I can also brace my arm against my upper body here. I'm going to push in, form a slightly thinner wall, and slowly move up along the form. Again, most of the motion and pressure is with the outside hand. Pull it up, go ahead and remove the water. If I can't get my hand down in there easily, I just bring it into a smaller form and slowly work it down, allow it to stretch out the clay. Then after I've removed the water, I can position my hands and just push it back in. Clean off the clay. Wet the interior. Squeeze in. And very slowly, gradually, rhythmically pull the clay up. Once we remove the water, make sure you compress that top lip, straighten it out. What we want to try to do is to pull a form that is at least twice as high as it is wide, and trying to get this form pulled up in 3 pulls. If you're using more than 3 pulls, you're overworking the clay. You're adding extra water, it's going to weaken the walls of the clay. Once you have this form pulled up, go ahead and take a tool. And using the cutting end of the tool here, I'm going to hold it at a right angle to the piece. I don't want to hold it in like this because I'll have a tendency to cut into the form. But if I hold it at a right angle to it, I can shave the extra clay down. I'll look on the interior and exterior of the form and slowly cut away this excess clay. Cut all the way down to the wheel head, then slice underneath the clay, stop the wheel, and pull that excess away. Once I've removed that excess, I'm going to go ahead and cut slightly under the piece to allow the wire to ride under there easily. If I do not want these throwing marks in here, I can go ahead and smooth those over with my wooden rib. My inside hand is going straight down. The side of my finger will rest against the wall. The rib will be on the outside. I will make sure that the clay is moving away from the edge of the rib. I won't want to turn it back this way where the clay will catch into the edge. I'm pushing my inside finger against the rib on the outside. Again, I put water in there, so I want to go ahead and remove it again. Straighten out the top rim. Clean up the wheel head a little bit. Remove the water from my hands. Take a towel. Dry off my hands slightly. Take the wire tool. I'm going to draw it up just slightly larger than the diameter of the piece. I'm going to have the wheel going very slowly. I'm going to hold the wire down against the wheel head with my thumbs. And as the wheel turns, cut loose the clay. Take my fingers and splay them out, put it around the pot, and pick that up like that. Let's go ahead and see what the wall looks like. Cut down through here. Remove some of this excess clay from here. You can see that the wall is fairly even up. It's gotten a little bit thin through here. The bottom thickness is about the same thickness of the wall, and the rim area is slightly thicker than the rest of the wall. This will help it retain its round shape during the throwing process. And that's your first cylinder form. two pieces here that show the different trimming type of operation that you can do, the type of feet that you can do. One is called a hidden foot. This is where the outside of the pot becomes the outside of the foot. On this one, the visible foot, the foot is seen from the outside of the pot. If I take these and turn them around, you can see on this one, you cannot see the foot from the outside. On this one, you can when they're sitting down on the surface. When we get ready to trim, we want to make sure the pot is in the proper dryness. If it's too wet, it's going to be difficult for you to tell the thickness of the piece and where to trim it off. If it's too dry, it'll come off in chunks and it'll leave a mess. So we want to get the pot at the right dryness. On this piece is leather hard, and at that point you can still stick your fingernail into it to make marks, but it's stiff enough now at this point that were you to try to change the shape, as I'm going to do with this one, it would break the piece. So I'm going to take the top and squeeze it. You can see how it's breaking along here. It's dry enough that it would break if you altered the shape. So it's necessary to find the right wetness for the piece for trimming. On this piece, go ahead and trim the bottom, but first I need to recenter it upside down. I'm going to place it on the wheel. I can use the concentric rings that are etched in the wheel head to help me find its center. What I'm concerned with is not centering this portion, but making sure this portion up here is centered, because this is where I'm going to be working. What I want to do is take a tool that'll have a sharp point on it and have the wheel going around. Slowly bring the tool up to the piece to where it first makes a mark in the clay. Where it makes that mark, it's only on this one side. That's the portion that's out from the center. I need to move that back into the center. So I'll shift the pot over a little bit, smooth over my mark, and go ahead and bring the tool up to it again. We keep doing this until it marked it equally all the way around the pot. Then I would know that the portion that I'm going to be trimming is centered. Alternatively, I can tap it into the center. What I would do with the tapping is use my left hand over here in case I hit it too hard and knock it off from the wheel. I'm going to use my right fingers to tap the pot down here. If I tap it up here, I can knock the piece over. As the piece comes around, tap it until it comes into the center. Now this is going to take quite a bit of practice. So you can get a can, a 1 pound coffee can, put a little bit of sand in the bottom and practice with that. Once I have it centered, then I'll go ahead and take some small pieces of clay and use those to anchor the piece down to the wheel. Roll out some coil shapes, bend them to conform around the piece, and press down. It's important that you press down and not in, otherwise you can distort the top of the pot. Once I have it anchored down, select the trimming tool that I'm going to use. You can hold it like a pencil, or you can hold it between your thumb and fingers and use another finger to push down on it. The first thing I want to do is remove excess material from the outside. I'm going to hold the tool firmly against the piece, and as the clay comes off, it should come off in long ribbons. If it's coming off in ribbons and sticking, then it's too wet. If it's coming on in little tiny chunks, then it's too dry, and perhaps wetting the surface a bit will resolve that. On this one, I'll do the hidden foot, so I'll use the exterior of the pot to form the outside of the foot ring. Once I've trimmed off the excess from here, I'm going to go ahead and mark the interior. Then I find for beginners the best thing to do is work in stages, trimming out little bits as I carefully move towards the outside. Now as you see me working here, I'm moving my fingers from my left hand into the center to help hold the pot down. The coils of clay down here will hold it in the center, but nothing is holding it down against the wheel. So I want to constantly push down here. As you get more proficient with your trimming methods, then you can slowly move out in a smoother motion to remove the clay. When you think you've removed enough clay from the pot, go ahead and give it a tap. If it's at the correct wetness and you give it a tap, you'll feel it move down as you reach the right thickness. Okay, that's at the right thickness there. I'm going to head and remove any sharp edges, because later on when the pot is fired and it becomes very hard, it can chip on the edge or create scratches in a table surface. Then I'm going to use the flexible rib and push it against the clay. This will burnish the surface and remove any marks from the grog that's in the clay. Also want to smooth the interior and smooth over this foot ring. If you can't get into the middle with the tool, switch to your modeling tool and use that. If the clay is soft enough, you can even use your fingers to accomplish the same thing. When you're finished, you want to go ahead and mark your name in the bottom of it and a date if you wish. You can move the pot, the wheel, and with the hidden foot ring, it sits on the surface. You don't see the outside, but you do see, as you pick it up, the finished foot ring. On this other one, I'm going to go ahead and show you a visible foot ring. I'm going to do the same operation. Now, one thing I find useful for students is if you have a difficult time looking at the thickness that you've achieved at the bottom from throwing, then you can take a pair of calipers and measure the inside and transfer that measurement to the outside. Place this on the wheel. Tap it into the center. Put the lumps of clay down here. Go ahead and start with the outside. It's a good idea to be going fairly rapidly as you're trimming so that you can keep it even. You want to move up along the form very carefully so that you trim equally all the way around the pot. As you get to the stop portion, you want to go ahead and trim off some to separate the outside of the pot from the foot ring. On this one, I can see that the bottom is already fairly thin, so I'm not going to trim a lot of clay right from the middle of it. But I'll trim from out here. Go ahead and round this off a little bit. And smooth off this edge. Again, burnishing the surface. Smooth over the foot ring. Smooth over that. Mark the name in it. Move the clay lumps. And that's the finished foot on that one. And if you compare the two, this one creates a little pedestal to lift it up. This one sits down more on the surface. They accomplish the same objectives, just a slightly different look to them. Hi. My name is Bill Schran. I teach at Northern Virginia Community College. I've been working with clay for more than 25 years, and in this video I want to introduce you to the beginning stages of throwing a simple cylinder form. Before we get started with the cylinder, I want to go ahead and show you some of the tools we'll be working with. The first tool you'll be working with is the wire tool. We'll be using this to cut the clay from the bag and also to remove the pot from the wheel. In addition to that, you'll need a small sponge. We'll use this both for throwing and for lubricating the clay. We'll need a wooden modeling tool. We'll be using this for cutting the clay and also for modeling and changing its shape. A flexible rib. They're made out of plastic and rubber. This one happens to be made out of metal. We'll be using this for shaping the clay. A stiff rib, usually made out of wood, but it can also be made out of a hard rubber substance. And also this is used for shaping the clay. A needle tool, be used for cutting the clay. And some trimming tools. We'll be using this in the second stage of throwing, which will be trimming the pot. Before we get started with the throwing process, we need to get the clay from the bag, and if you do so, the clay has already been wedged, so it will not be necessary to go ahead and remove air pockets from it. But if you have used the clay and will reclaim it, then it will be necessary for you to go through a wedging process. Technical problems. With my wooden rib. Oops.
Well, you ready?
Yeah.
Okay.